The day started off like any other in the small town of Cedar Springs, tucked away in the heart of the country. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the sleepy streets. People went about their daily routines, some sipping coffee at the local cafe, others chatting in the park, and a few farmers tending to their fields. But that peaceful rhythm was suddenly shattered by an event no one could have expected. Without warning, a strange humming noise filled the air, growing louder and louder until it became almost unbearable. People looked up, squinting against the midday sun, and there, hovering above them in the sky, was a craft unlike anything they had ever seen. It was sleek and metallic, glimmering with strange colors, shifting as if it wasn't quite part of their world. The ship didn't make a sound as it descended, gently touching down right in the middle of Cedar Springs' main road. The dirt around it kicked up, swirling in an almost hypnotic pattern as the ship's sleek underside brushed against the earth. The town fell into complete silence, the kind of silence that blankets everything in a heavy fog of disbelief. It was the kind of moment when the world paused, and everyone in town shared a single thought. Something alien was here. People slowly gathered around the ship, whispering to one another in stunned disbelief. No one dared to get too close, but no one could look away either. The doors of the ship hissed open with a low mechanical groan, and three beings emerged. They were tall, much taller than any human, and their bodies shimmered in the sunlight, their skin smooth and metallic, reflecting the world around them. Their eyes were the strangest part. They glowed an eerie green, and the way they looked at everyone around them felt like they could see straight through them. They wore outfits that looked almost like armor, though it rippled in a strange way, almost as if it wasn't made from any material the humans could recognize. The aliens didn't speak, but their presence was commanding enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. Without a word, they walked toward the nearest building, the Rusty Nail, a small bar that had been standing on the corner of the street for decades. Jim, the bartender, had just finished wiping down the counter when he saw the beings approaching. His hand froze in the air, the rag hanging limply from his fingers. As the aliens pushed open the bar's door and entered, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the small space. Inside, the few regulars who had been nursing drinks froze at the sight of the aliens. It was hard to believe their eyes. The air in the bar seemed to thicken with tension. Jim, the old bartender, had lived through a lot of strange things, but this was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The aliens didn't sit down at a table or ask for a drink. Instead, they made their way to the bar itself, standing silently before Jim, who was struggling to find his voice. One of the aliens, its green eyes glowing brightly, turned its head toward Jim and pointed to the poker table in the corner. The alien's voice was mechanical but clear as it spoke. "Game. Cards. We win. We take your planet." Jim blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Cards," the alien repeated slowly. "We play. We win. We take your world." For a moment, the whole bar was silent, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak, to clarify if this was a joke or a nightmare. But it wasn't. The aliens weren't joking. And there was only one way this could go. Jim could refuse the challenge, or he could accept it. He knew the stakes were absurd, that it sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, but something in him stirred. A need to protect his town, his world. He swallowed hard and nodded, barely able to believe what was about to happen. "All right," Jim said, his voice steady despite the shock. "We'll play." The aliens didn't respond immediately, but the way they stood there, silent and still, sent a chill down Jim's spine. They hadn't just come for a drink. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to play a game of Texas Hold'em, and they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. As the townspeople gathered to watch, Jim shuffled the deck, knowing the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a poker game. This was a game that could decide the fate of humanity. And Jim wasn't about to let Earth lose without a fight. The tension in the rusty nail was palpable, like a heavy fog that clung to the air. The moment the aliens had made their challenge, something shifted in the room. The locals, who had been chatting and drinking just moments before, were now quiet, their eyes wide with disbelief. No one knew what to expect, but they all knew that this game of poker wasn't like any game they had ever seen. Jim, the bartender, stood behind the counter, his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled the deck of cards. The aliens remained at the table, their eerie green eyes locked on the pile of chips in front of them, as if contemplating the game on a level no human could understand. The aliens had not spoken a word since their challenge, their silence hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Jim noticed how their metallic skin shimmered in the dim light of the bar, and how they seemed to have an otherworldly calm about them. They weren't nervous, didn't seem to feel the weight of the moment. They simply waited, unfazed by the strange new world they had found themselves in. It was as if, in their minds, the outcome was already decided. But Jim wasn't about to let them win that easily. He had spent decades mastering the art of poker, reading people's faces, understanding the subtle signs of a bluff. But this wasn't going to be a typical game. This was an alien challenge, and there was no telling how things would play out. The table was set. The aliens hadn't asked for anything special. No flashy lights, no futuristic technology. They just wanted to play poker. Jim tried to push aside the strange unease that gnawed at his stomach as he dealt the first hand. The regulars in the bar watched quietly from the sidelines, too stunned to even speak. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing, but they couldn't look away either. This was history in the making, and they were right there, watching it unfold. The first cards were dealt, and Jim couldn't help but notice the way the aliens handled them. They didn't seem to touch the cards the same way a human would. Instead, they just hovered their fingers over them for a moment before pulling them in, their green eyes scanning the cards with a precision that was unsettling. They didn't even look at each other, didn't exchange any glances or words. It was as if the cards themselves were the only things that mattered. Jim, on the other hand, had to fight to stay calm. His own hand wasn't great. A pair of eights, which could be good if the right cards came up. But he knew better than to reveal any weakness. He played it cool, trying to remain focused. As the first round of betting began, the aliens made their move. Jim watched closely. There was no hesitation in their actions. One of the aliens simply extended its long metallic arm and placed a stack of chips onto the table. It was a quiet gesture, but the weight of it was enormous. The amount was more than Jim had ever seen anyone bet at the Rusty Nail, and it sent a ripple of shock through the room. The locals exchanged nervous glances, unsure if this was some kind of bluff, or if the aliens had truly come to play for keeps. Jim, however, didn't flinch. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a little shiny skin and glowing eyes. "Call," Jim said, his voice steady. The aliens didn't react, their expressionless faces betraying no sign of emotion. Jim couldn't help but wonder how much they knew about the game, whether they had studied poker, or if they were simply relying on their advanced knowledge of the universe to win. The game went on, and each round felt like it stretched on forever. The aliens didn't speak, didn't even show any signs of human-like emotion. They just played, their hands moving with calculated precision, almost as if they were following a pattern no one else could see. As the rounds progressed, Jim realized that this wasn't just a regular poker game. The aliens didn't seem to be bound by the same rules that governed humans. Every time Jim thought he had the upper hand, the aliens would do something strange, something that defied the very logic of the game. They seemed to bend the rules of probability, and their poker face was flawless. There was no way to read them. Jim had spent his whole life mastering the art of bluffing, but it seemed like the aliens had no need for such things. Their moves were swift, deliberate, and unyielding. Still, Jim pressed on. He wasn't about to let some alien beings take over his world without a fight. The crowd watched in complete silence, each person holding their breath as the game went on. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an energy no one had ever felt before. This wasn't just about cards anymore. It was about survival, about the fate of the planet. Jim could feel the weight of the challenge pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to give up. As the final round neared, his eyes narrowed in determination. The game had only just begun, and no matter what, he wasn't going down without a fight. The game had reached a critical point, and the tension in the rusty nail was unbearable. Jim could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. The cards on the table felt heavier now, as if they held the weight of the entire world. The aliens hadn't spoken much since they first sat down, but their presence was enough to send a chill through anyone who dared to look at them. Their expressions remained blank, their glowing green eyes scanning the table with an unsettling intensity. They weren't just playing a game, they were studying it, as if every move, every card dealt, was part of something much larger. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head, but he couldn't back down now. Not when so much was at stake. Jim's hand wasn't great anymore. The initial confidence he had felt at the start of the game had started to wane as the rounds went on. He had tried to read the aliens to figure out if they were bluffing, if they were playing according to the rules. But with every hand, it became more and more apparent that the aliens didn't follow the same logic. Their movements were calculated, their choices deliberate, and every time Jim thought he had an edge, they seemed to have an answer. There was something about the way they played that was beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just strategy. It was like they had the ability to predict the future. Jim couldn't explain it. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the aliens were playing with a kind of knowledge that went beyond anything Jim could grasp. The crowd that had gathered around the bar was silent, their eyes fixed on the table. They hadn't moved, hadn't even taken a breath since the game began. Jim could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their hopes pressing down on him. He was the only thing standing between the aliens and their claim on Earth. The thought hung heavily in his mind, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about the crowd. It wasn't about the stakes. This was about winning. He had to win. There was no other option. The aliens placed another massive bet, their long, metallic fingers moving with precision as they added more chips to the pile. Jim hesitated for a moment, staring at his cards. The pair of eights he had started with was nothing now. He had managed to build a small straight, but it wasn't enough to be confident. He had to make a decision. Every instinct in him told him to fold, to walk away from this, and live to fight another day. But something else was driving him. Something stronger than fear or logic. This was it. If he folded, he might as well hand the Earth over to them right now. Jim pushed forward, matching the aliens' bet. The room was thick with anticipation. Every person there felt it, the weight of the decision Jim had just made. Was it the right move? The aliens didn't seem to care either way. Their expressions were unreadable, their focus fixed on the cards. Jim didn't have that luxury. His eyes flicked from the cards to the aliens and back again, desperately searching for any sign, any hint that could give him an advantage. But there was nothing. They were a perfect enigma, a puzzle that couldn't be solved. The next card was revealed, and it was a king of spades. Jim's heart skipped a beat. That was the card he had been waiting for. He now had a straight flush. The aliens didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the change in the game. Jim's mind raced. He couldn't believe his luck. He had done it. He had the best possible hand he could have hoped for. He felt a surge of confidence, a fleeting moment where everything seemed clear. But then, just as quickly, doubt crept in. The aliens hadn't made a single move that Jim had predicted. They hadn't even looked at their cards the same way a human would. What if they had something even greater, something beyond what he could understand? Jim stared at the table, his thoughts swirling, and then he realized something. The aliens weren't playing for the same reason he was. They weren't trying to win for the sake of the game. This was a test, an experiment perhaps, to see how far they could push. How far could they go before the humans folded? Jim wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. They weren't just interested in poker. They were interested in how far humanity could be stretched before breaking. Jim had no intention of letting them see that weakness. Not now, not ever. With a steady hand he placed his final bet. His voice, when it came, was calm, even though his mind was racing. "I'll raise you." The room fell silent. Everyone, holding their breath, waiting to see what the aliens would do. For the first time, there was a flicker in their eyes, a subtle shift in their posture. They hadn't expected this. Jim had played the perfect hand, and now it was their move. They didn't hesitate, not for a second. The chips piled up, the aliens adding more to the growing stack. This wasn't just about a game anymore. Jim had made his choice. Now the fate of the world rested on the next move. The air in the rusty nail had thickened, and every eye in the bar was on the table. The game had stopped being a mere contest of cards. It had become a battle of wills. Jim's pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the aliens' every move, their eerie green eyes flickering only for a moment as their long metallic fingers hovered over the pile of chips. They had raised the stakes again, and Jim couldn't help but feel a tightening knot in his stomach. He had already placed his bet, matching the aliens' previous raise. But now, as the final card was about to be dealt, it seemed like nothing he had ever experienced before. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about poker anymore. This was something far more dangerous, something far bigger. The Rusty Nail, a humble local bar, had turned into a stage for a high-stakes game that could alter the course of human history, and Jim was at the center of it, with everything to lose. As the dealer, the local bartender Jim, prepared to reveal the final card, the silence in the room became almost deafening. The hum of the overhead lights, the shuffle of the cards, even the distant clink of glasses being set down, all felt like they were happening in slow motion. Jim's mind raced. His hand had improved with the last card. A Queen of Hearts had appeared, giving him a flush with the cards he had. It wasn't the unbeatable hand he had been hoping for, but it was strong enough to stand on its own, and Jim knew the aliens had been playing cautiously. His chances of winning were high, but he wasn't sure whether that was even enough to outplay the mysterious aliens at the table. They weren't bound by the same logic that governed humans, and that was what made them so unpredictable. Jim wasn't sure if they could see the future, or if they simply didn't care about the game's rules. What was clear was that they were playing for more than money or pride. This game, in some strange way, was a test of humanity, of Earth itself. The bartender slowly slid the final card onto the table, his hand trembling ever so slightly. The card revealed was the 10 of spades. Jim's heart sank. The aliens' move had been swift, and it was too late for Jim to change anything. His flush, though solid, could be outdone by a higher flush, or even a straight flush. The aliens had been calm, poised, no emotional reaction when the last card was placed. They simply sat there, still as statues, staring down at their cards with a level of concentration that made Jim's nerves spike. They didn't seem concerned at all, their poker faces so perfectly crafted that it was impossible to read them. Jim's mind spun, wondering what he had missed, what he hadn't seen. Every calculation he had made, every hand he had played, now seemed insignificant in the face of the unknown. Then, without warning, one of the aliens slowly reached out with its long, thin hand, placing a monstrous stack of chips on the table. Far more than Jim had ever dared to bet. The room gasped collectively. Jim's hands clenched, his knuckles turning white as he tried to keep his composure. The aliens were going all in. There was no turning back now. They weren't bluffing. They weren't trying to confuse him. They had a plan. Jim's instinct screamed at him to fold, to save whatever pride he had left, but the thought of quitting in the face of this alien force felt impossible. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for the people of Earth. The room had gone completely silent, everyone's eyes trained on him. Every person in the bar was holding their breath, waiting for the final moment to come. Jim sat back in his chair, staring at his hand. His mind buzzed with 100 different thoughts, each one urging him to act quickly. But there was no way to read the aliens, no way to predict what they would do next. Jim had always trusted his instincts, but in this moment, he wasn't sure if they would be enough. The aliens weren't just strange beings from another world. They were the unknown. And that was what scared Jim the most. If he lost this hand, it wasn't just a game over. It was the end of everything he knew, everything he had fought for. The aliens had come here to make their mark, and they weren't leaving without a victory. The bartender, Jim, raised his gaze from his hand and looked into the aliens' glowing green eyes. For a fleeting second, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition of the gravity of the moment. Jim swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the world pressing on him. With a steady hand, he pushed all of his chips into the middle of the table, matching the aliens' bet. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a fight for survival. The moment the chips clinked into place, Jim knew that the decision had been made. There was no turning back. The game had reached its final stage, and what happened next would determine the fate of not just one man, but of Earth itself. The atmosphere in the rusty nail grew so thick with tension, it felt as if the air itself had stopped moving. The game was no longer about poker, no longer a simple contest of luck and strategy. It had evolved into something far more dangerous, something bigger than any of the players had expected. Jim could feel the weight of every eye on him, from the alien players to the onlookers who had gathered at the bar. They watched in silence, waiting for the conclusion, for a victor to emerge from this strange and high-stakes game. The chips piled high in the center of the table, a mountain of anticipation. Jim had gone all in, matching the aliens' immense bet, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. His mind raced, thoughts and doubts crashing against each other. His hand was strong, strong enough to win against most opponents. But would it be enough against the aliens? He didn't know. He couldn't know. As he stared down at his cards, Jim's thoughts began to swirl. The aliens had been playing with such precision, so unnervingly calm, as if every move they made was part of a grand design. They were far from the bumbling extraterrestrials Jim had once imagined. There was nothing naive or unprepared about them. They weren't like the movies, with weak spots waiting to be exploited. No, these aliens were smart. They had been watching, studying, calculating every possible outcome, and Jim had no idea what they were planning next. He had expected a game, of chance, a battle of skill and luck. But he quickly realized that wasn't the kind of game he was involved in. This was something else. It felt like the aliens had already decided the outcome before the first card had even been dealt, and Jim was simply a pawn in their larger scheme. The bartender's voice broke the silence as he slowly reached for the deck. His hands were steady, controlled, as he prepared to reveal the final cards. The tension in the room reached its peak. It felt as if the entire universe had stopped, holding its breath along with the crowd. Jim tried to steady himself, pushing aside the voice in his head that urged him to fold, to walk away. He couldn't back out now, not when everything depended on him. The aliens had made their move. Now it was his turn to face the consequences. With deliberate slowness, the bartender placed the final 2 cards onto the table. One was revealed, a jack of spades, and the other, a 10 of diamonds. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The aliens didn't react. They didn't flinch, didn't seem to care about the new cards. Jim's breath hitched. The hands on the table had changed dramatically, and the game had taken a sudden turn. His straight flush, once strong, had now been outdone by the alien's hand. They had managed to draw a higher straight flush, and it became apparent that Jim had lost. For a moment, the world felt like it was spinning. He sat frozen, staring at the table, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. How had they done it? He had thought his hand was unbeatable, but the aliens had somehow managed to manipulate the game, playing in a way that defied all logic. His stomach sank as the realization set in. He had lost. The aliens had won. The moment felt surreal, like a dream Jim couldn't escape. His body tensed, but he couldn't move. His thoughts scattered, and every sense seemed to sharpen, as though he was watching everything unfold from a distance. The aliens, however, didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat or react with any kind of emotion. They simply leaned back in, their chairs, their glowing green eyes continuing to observe the human players with unnerving calm. There was no arrogance, no smugness, just quiet, unwavering confidence. They had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory Jim had expected. There was something far more unsettling about their silence. Their game wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something deeper. Jim didn't know what, but he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a bet for money. It wasn't a bet for power. The aliens weren't interested in the stakes they had set. They were interested in Jim and his reaction. The fate of the Earth didn't matter to them. They were testing humanity, testing Jim, to see how far they could push. Jim didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the table, his mind racing to make sense of everything that had happened. Slowly, though, his sense of defiance began to rise. The aliens had won, yes, but they had underestimated one thing: the human spirit. Jim might have lost the game, but he wasn't going to lose the fight. Not yet. The aliens had seen his hand and believed they had won, but what they didn't realize was that humanity had an unpredictability to it. There was always a way to outsmart those who thought they could predict everything. And Jim, despite the loss, was determined to make sure that the aliens' victory wouldn't be the last word in this strange game. The battle might be over, but the war, whatever it was, had just begun. The tension that had filled the rusty nail seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the world itself had paused in anticipation of what would happen next. Jim sat at the table, the weight of defeat heavy in his chest, his mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The aliens' calm, unblinking gaze was still fixed on him, their eyes glowing softly in the dim light of the bar. They had won the game. Of that there was no doubt. The final cards had revealed their superior hand, a straight flush that had easily beaten Jim's. His stomach twisted with the bitter taste of loss. But as the silence stretched, he realized something deeper was at play. The aliens didn't look like conquerors. They didn't revel in their victory. Instead, they remained oddly detached, as if their true objective had never been the game at all. Jim had been a part of something far larger than he could have imagined. The bartender, who had been quietly observing the game, now stepped forward and began to collect the chips from the table. His face was impassive, but Jim could tell that he was just as shaken by the events as everyone else in the room. The humans in the bar had been expecting a simple game of poker, But what they had witnessed was anything but. The aliens' victory was undeniable, but it seemed that something had shifted in the air. Jim felt it too. A change in the atmosphere, a shift in the power dynamic. Whatever the aliens had wanted from this game, it had been achieved. But what, exactly, had they won? The first alien, the one who had been the most involved in the game, finally broke the silence. Its voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an unsettling undertone to it. "The game is over," it said simply, its words floating into the room like an unsettling truth. Jim, despite the loss, felt his heart race. There was something in the alien's tone, something that hinted at a deeper understanding, an intelligence far beyond what humans were accustomed to. The alien's eyes locked onto Jim's, and for a brief moment it felt as though the entire universe was held within that gaze. It was as though the alien was peering directly into his soul, searching for something only it could understand. "We have learned what we came here to learn," the alien continued, its voice never wavering. "Your species is unpredictable. You do not think as we do, and yet you possess a resilience we did not anticipate. It is fascinating." Jim's pulse quickened. He had expected the aliens to gloat, to celebrate their victory, but instead, they were analyzing him, studying him as if he were a specimen in a lab. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a game of poker. This had been a test of humanity, a test of how Earth would respond to the unknown, to an intelligence far beyond its own. And Jim, despite his loss, had been a part of that test. The other aliens remained silent, their expressionless faces betraying no emotion. They seemed to be waiting for something, but Jim couldn't tell what. The bartender, who had been collecting the chips, suddenly stopped and looked at Jim, his expression hardening. It was then that Jim understood. The game was never about the money. It had never been about winning or losing. The stakes had been something else entirely. The aliens had come to Earth not to conquer or to destroy, but to test. They wanted to know how humans would react when faced with the unknown, how humanity would respond to a challenge that defied all logic and reason. In that moment, Jim understood what the aliens were truly searching for. They weren't interested in Earth's resources or its technology. They didn't care about the game's outcome. They cared about the humans who played it. Jim realized that they had been watching him, studying how he reacted, how he thought, and how he responded to the pressures of the game. The aliens had been trying to understand something fundamental about humanity, something that went beyond the rules of poker. They had seen how Jim had fought against the odds, how he had persevered, even when the game seemed stacked against him, and in that, they had found what they were looking for. The spirit of humanity. The alien leaned back, its gaze still locked on Jim. "You have passed the test," it said quietly. "And for that, we offer you a gift." Jim blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. A gift? After everything that had just happened? But before he could say anything, the aliens stood, their movements synchronized, almost mechanical. The room seemed to shrink around him as they made their way toward the door. The bartender, still standing in stunned silence, finally spoke. What does this mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. The alien paused, looking back over its shoulder. "It means you have been watched, and now you are ready." With those final words, the aliens left the Rusty Nail, disappearing into the night. The bar was left in stunned silence. The chips remained on the table, untouched, as if the game had never ended. Jim sat there, still processing the strange events that had just unfolded. It hadn't been just a game. It had been a moment of reckoning. And now, with the aliens gone, there was only one thing left to consider. What came next? What did humanity's future look like now that the test had been passed? Jim didn't know, but he was certain of one thing. Earth had just crossed a threshold, and things would never be the same again.